Okay, would you say something?
Okay. Does it sound all right?
Sounds fine. I'll move it over a little closer to you because I'm more interested in getting you than me. Okay, Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 33, May 4th, 2006. We're visiting with Marvin Evenson at Sioux Falls. Marvin, where and when were you born?
I was born in Sargent County, North Dakota on September 9th, 1912, in Ransom Township, which was between the towns of Rutland and Cayuga, North Dakota, which is right close to the South Dakota line, just a short distance from South Dakota line.
Where was your family originally from? Sounds Scandinavian.
Well, my first family that came to America was Ole Evenson from Norway, and he came to Lake Mills, Iowa in 1871. And then he brought his family, his wife and 5 children, one of them was my grandfather, to America in 1872. They farmed close to Lake Mills for a number of years. My grandfather grew up there and took part in a lot of activities in Lake Mills during the time they were growing up. And in 1883, the Buffalo County had been platted and it opened up for homesteading. And 5 Norwegian families, my grandfather, great-grandfather, one of them, decided to go out there on a homestead in 1883. So these families, 5 families went out there, and they, in the late summer and fall, and built their claim shacks. And then in 1884, the families moved out there. The family came with the property and so on, furnishings, household goods, and whatnot by immigrant car to Ree Heights from Lake Mills. But my grandfather and a couple of other young men who were in their late teens or early 20s drove all the livestock for the 5 families from Lake Mills to Fort Thompson, South Dakota, Buffalo County in 1884. And from there, the family has expanded to be a very large family. We're a big relationship.
You have a lot of brothers and sisters?
I only have, I had 2 brothers, and I have 1 sister still alive. I'm the oldest in the family. My brother Bud, or Orville, who was just 18 months younger than I, lost his life in the Second World War. And the Legion post in my hometown of Rutland is named after him. My brother Leland, younger brother, just died a couple of years ago, and he had a large family. And my sister is still living in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Okay. And your dad's name was again?
Edwin.
Edwin.
S. Evenson.
Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about him?
Well, my dad was a farmer. He was the 3rd in the family of 10 with my grandfather, John, married my grandma at Fort Thompson, South Dakota in 1885. And he had homesteaded there, but he knew about the Wahpeton Sisseton reservation opening up for settlement by homesteading on the land that the Native Americans wouldn't preempt. And so they moved to Waugh Bay area in about 1889, or I think it was 1889, because my father was born at Waugh Bay in 1890. And my grandfather homesteaded right 2 miles into the South Dakota line from North Dakota in 1892 when that opened up for settlement.
Okay. And your mother, what was her name?
My mother's name was Johanna Evans Johnson, and her folks had been married in Norway in 1886 and came to America right after they were married and settled first at Christine, North Dakota, and then a year or two later my grandfather got some preempt land at Rutland area and moved down there, so he was one of the pioneers in that area. So. And I guess my dad went across the line and met my mother over there, and that's why they were married. So he wasn't a South Dakota man anymore.
Okay. What are some of your early memories
from the family?
Farm? Yeah, from the farm.
Well, I remember we were really not a very well-off farmers. We were what would consider poor farmers, although we didn't know we were poor, I guess. We lived close to where my mother's folks had homesteaded. In fact, this on adjoining quarters. My dad had worked as a young man before he was married for a man by the name of Anton Severson who owned that land. And when my dad got married, Severson told him he was going to go to Canada, Alberta, Canada, and look at land that was being offered pretty cheaply in Canada. So he leased the land to my father after he was married, and then Severson went to Canada and did establish himself in farming up in Alberta. And then he sold the land after leasing it to my father for a couple of years. He sold it to my father.
What kind of a farming operation did you have then? Diversified farming?
Yes, yeah, we had a small diversified farm. It was only 160 acres, and we had cattle and hogs, of course, no sheep, but all kinds of poultry, turkeys and chickens. And I remember my mother hatching chickens on an incubator, and we always managed to get by real well, I think, because we were... And my mother's sister lived on a neighboring farm, too. She had been married. She was a little younger than my mother, but she got married earlier than my mother. And so there was... And then my Uncle Jake, my mother's brother, farmed with my grandpa. There was 2 houses on the home farm. So we were all in a small cluster there. My mother's brother and my mother's sister and our family. So the Ole Johnson family were really a close-knit family. I might mention that this Anton Severson, after a few years in Canada, talked to my dad about coming to Canada and looking at land up there too. And in Alberta, near Camrose, is a small town called New Norway, and it was near there where Severson had homesteaded, and it was real good land, very level and rock-free, and it was very good land. So my dad went up there when I was about 6 years old or so, probably right at the time of the end of the First World War. Well, anyway, my dad was kind of liked the idea that maybe it'd be good to move to Canada. But when he got home and talked it over with my mother, my mother cried for 2 days, and we never moved to Canada.
Okay, all right. So you were about, what, 5 years old when we got into World War One?
Yeah.
Yeah, you remember much about that, or is that a little...
Well, I just remember the day that the war ended. My dad's youngest sister, May, had married a man by the name of Lars Hilleston, and he had been drafted, so he was overseas. He had just gone overseas not too long before the war ended. And she was living with us at the time, kind of, because they didn't have a home of their own, and yet, and And being the youngest one of my dad's sisters, why, she was staying with us. And I well remember the night that that we heard the bells ring and the sirens blowing and stuff in both Cayuga and Rutland. We could hear them clear out to our place. And Aunt May was so happy about the fact that the war was over with. That was in 1918, of course. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That would have been also another event that I've talked about with some of the other folks I've interviewed. So a lot of them are too young to, but was the flu outbreak in 1918. Do you remember anything about that?
Yes, I remember the flu outbreak quite well because we lost a neighbor boy who my dad stayed up with all night who died, and I can remember his death. And I remember well that we became ill with it, and my brother, Bud, was quite ill from it. And I remember that one thing happened. My grandma was at our place kind of helping to take care of us. I guess when we were sick, she would come to see my mother quite often. My mother was rather poorly at times, and so she had some flu effect too. My dad didn't. But my grandma was going to give me some cough medicine, and instead of reaching for the cough medicine bottle, she grabbed the turpentine bottle and put it. And I swallowed it fast. I remember it burning me, but I think it helped my flu because it probably burned the flu bug out of me because I didn't get very sick from it. But it was one thing I remember about the flu years. And I remember many of our neighbors. Some of our neighbors, the Jacobsons, they lost many of their people that were in their teens and so on from the flu.
Mm-hmm. Seemed like it was hard on young people.
Yeah, and it was this Fleming boy who was a neighbor. I can still remember my dad coming home from the night that he died. They were only a quarter of a mile away, and my dad would go and sit up with him because his folks had other children, and it was tough on them to see their boy die. And Dad cried. I remember him crying. I'd never seen him cry before, but he bawled like a baby because the Fleming boy, who was only about 17, 18 years old, had died of flu.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have any relatives that served in World War I?
Yes, we had several uncles and cousins, my dad's cousins, and so on. And we had a hired man. During the years that Bud and I were in our 4 or 5 years old, we had a big Swede by the name of Ben Nelson. He was over 6 feet tall, probably 6'3", a great big husky guy, and he used to bounce Bud and I, one on each shoulder like nobody's business, and was a great guy. Dad, both he and his brother entered the service, and Ben was killed in Europe close to the end of the year, and Bud and I could never figure out why in the world Big Ben didn't come back and be our hired man anymore. But his brother Even came back and married a local girl and lived in that community for quite a number of years until he moved to Minneapolis, and there's where he lived and died later on. So.
Mm-hmm. After the war, the farm economy kind of went downhill from what it had been in the mid-teens.
Yeah.
How did that affect things around where your family were living?
Well, of course, my dad bought the farm during the war years from Severson, and during the war years prices were good, but he didn't, I don't know whether he completely paid off the mortgage or not, but to Severson. But anyway, after the break of the war, where prices went bad and some crops didn't work out too well, and my dad did lose the farm. and it was taken over by finance companies, I think, and then sold to insurance companies, so that there was an insurance company that owned title to the land. And then my dad rented from them for many years and never again did own any land of his own.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Did he ultimately just stick with 160 acres, or did he ultimately?
No, he went bigger than that later on. I tried to farm with him for a while after I got out of high school in 1930, and then the dry, tough years came along. Of course, the bank holiday and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So there was tough times.
Yeah.
Dry years.
Yeah. Was there very much farm organization activity around there at that time?
Well, there was beginning to be. We learned of Charlie Talbot, of course, was around making speeches, joining the Farmers Union. Mm-hmm. And there was cooperative elevators and cooperative shipping associations being formed, and so there was a big. The township that I grew up in was a very liberal township. The fact it still is one of the liberal areas of the state of North Dakota. Mm-hmm. Pam Gullison, who is wife to one of the great-grandson of one of the pioneer families of that area, is a very liberal leader in the North Dakota legislature, mm-hmm. Pam Gullison. And her kids and her sons are active in the Farmers Union in North Dakota. Mm-hmm. And so that seemed to be always a very liberal area. There was in the township where I grew up, there seemed to be there was probably more than 5, but within the church, in my home church area, there was 5 prominent families, and 4 were Norwegians. 1 was a Swede. The Swede was kind of a little. He'd agitate the Norwegians once in a while because he didn't always agree with their religious ideas, but they were the key members in our church. During when the year that North Dakota became a state, in South Dakota, 1889, the secretary, who had been secretary from the time the church started in 1884, the church I grew up in, started writing a diary in 1889. The young farmers in that area must have thought that something was going to happen. This man was a single man who had come from Norway to Minnesota in 1880, and in 1884 he came out to our area of North Dakota because he had a sister who was very prominent. Her husband was very good in that area. Is that my daughter? Somebody?
Either somebody or a cat.
Cat. Yeah. Well, anyway, this man wrote a 6-year Norwegian diary in 2 different books. And I through a series of events, I became the possessor of those 2 diaries books.
Oh, okay.
And I had them translated into English from Norwegian. Mm-hmm. One book has 256 pages, the other 300 pages. And it's a tremendous story of the pioneers in that area and connection with the church. He was very religious, and but he brings out many things, and he also is quite political. He brings out the fact of the nonpartisan league meetings in town, and how there was big crowds, and how
a lot of banks failed. You mentioned the bank holiday, then that would have been up in 1933, but there were a lot of banks that failed.
Oh, they
prior
failed
to
before that, yeah, 29.
Even, yeah, into the 20s.
27,
yeah.
28, 29.
Yeah.
Yeah, my grandpa, John Evenson, lost much savings that he had in the bank at that time, because in my little hometown of Rutland, there was, I think, even a couple of banks at one time, and at Cougar there was a bank, and so there was a bank even in Cougar, the bank in Cougar stayed operating all the time until through the bank holiday it opened up again. I was teaching school when Roosevelt declared the bank holiday, and I was taking warrants for my pay, but our warrants in Ransom Township were good because we had a railroad running through the township, Great Northern Railroad, and we had an Otter Tail Power Highline, so I didn't have to take script for or discount my warrants. I got full pay on the warrants. But I went to the banker the day that I had a warrant, and I went in the bank to cash it, and Ben Cutler says to me, "God damn you there, you Democrats, now Roosevelt has said I can't operate my bank. He's closed the bank." So he says, I don't know whether that script will ever be any good. And I looked at him kind of funny, and I said, "Listen, Mr. Cutler," I said, "you know what?" I said, "I think when your bank opens again after Roosevelt has done what he wants to get done," I said, "your bank will be a hell of a lot better than it is right today." I said, because I think that there'd be some protection to your depositors and so on. And a few months later, Ben saw me and he said, "God damn, Marvin, I guess you were right." He knew I was active in the Young Democrats Club in town. Area.
One of the things I usually ask people about is their schooling. Do you go to country school up there?
Yes, I went graduated from the 8th grade of country school. I guess I skipped a few years, and then in 1924, and at that time Rutland only had 2 years of high school, and my dad thought I was probably too young to go to high school, so he had me stay home a year. And I could stay with my grandfather, John Evenson, and his wife had lived in a small house in Rutland, and my grandpa was second man in the elevator in town, so I could stay with them, and go to high school, because all their kids were gone except Uncle Clarence, who was still in the Army at that time over in the Philippines, and he would be coming home and be there for part of the time I was in. So I didn't go to high school until the fall of 25. And so 25 and 26 I went to high school in Rutland, and then 27 and 28, well, that was the 2 years of high school. Well, then the closest high school was Foreman, North Dakota, and that was far away, and there was 3 other boys in my class, that all, or was it 4? Let's see, I don't know, maybe 3 other guys. No, there was 4 actually. They went to Foreman to high school, but I couldn't afford to go there, so I stayed home another year. So then in 28, Rutland got 4 years of high school. So then I went back for 1 year there, and I had taken enough credit, so I only needed 3 more to graduate from. And a friend of mine, neighbor boy, who I'd gone through grade school with all the time, and had a chance to go right away to high school at Foreman. He got a chance to stay with the minister at Foreman because he had 2 sisters older that were teachers, and they could afford to pay for him. So he kept right on going to school. And in his first year of college, he went to Park Region at Fergus Falls because they not only had an academy, but they had a junior college, 2 years of college. They also had a commercial department. They had a teacher's department. And so it was a kind of a amalgamated school, and there was a pretty good enrollment. Half of them probably stayed at the dorms, and the other half were local students. But anyway, because he had gone there and he liked it, he said, "Marvin, you only got 3 years left. Why don't you go to Park Region and finish your high school and take some college credits?" So I says, "Well, how in the world can I afford to go down there?" "Well," he says, "it probably won't cost you too much." And he says, "Maybe you can get a job to work for some of your tuition and so on." Mm-hmm. So because he was going with a girl over and had kind of fallen for a girl with Rothsey, Minnesota, one Sunday, maybe in July, he decided he wanted to go over there and see her one weekend. So he says, "Let's go early." He says, "We'll go on a Friday, and then you can talk to the people at Park Region." So I went along with him over to Minnesota to see his girlfriend and stopped at Park Region and had a visit with the administration. And then they told me that, well, there would be a possibility of me getting a chance to do some work for part of my tuition and so on. And, of course, I would have to board there in the dormitory, men's dormitory. So in the fall of '29, then, this is what happened. I made quite a bit of money during thrashing and did some extra work after thrashing was over. And I'd been working with my dad on the farm, of course. And so then I went to Park Region in the fall of 1929 and became active in an awful lot of things in school there. And then, of course, in '30, things were beginning to get kind of bad, and I couldn't go on to college anyplace. But my friend went to Concordia after the first year at Park Region and graduated from Concordia. And later on took his master's degree from the University of North Dakota State University in Fargo. So
once known as an agricultural college.
Yeah. North Dakota State Agricultural College at that time.
I'm originally from North Dakota. So.
Yeah. Are you originally from North Dakota?
Yeah.
Where at?
Northwest of Grand Forks. A place called Inkster.
What's the name?
Inkster is the
Inkster.
town.
Yeah, Inkster. I think we had a boy at Park Region from Inkster.
Really?
Yeah, I can't remember what his name was now, but I'm pretty sure we did, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was quite a population there at that time.
Yeah.
Not much anymore. But.
No. Is there anything left of it?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you mentioned teaching. How did you get into that?
Well, that's kind of a story all in itself. After Park Region and I couldn't go to college, I farmed with my dad as much as I could. He rented a larger farm, and we farmed more acres. He bought a Fordson tractor, and both my brother and I helped him out on the farm. And then we worked for neighboring farmers and so on. But anyway, in the spring of 1932, our local school was having trouble keeping women teachers. There was several big boys and 4 or 5 fairly older girls too. It was a big school, 20-some students, 23 I think it was. And the school director there was 4 schools in that township, and so the school director, Henry Johnson, came to my dad and he said, "You know, Ed," he said, "I can't get anybody no women. They'll teach here 1 year and then they go. They want to teach again," he says, "and we can't get any women teachers to apply for the school." And he says, "Why in the hell can't Marvin teach?" And so my dad says, "Well, how could he do that?" Well, he says he's had a little college education, he said, and He says, I think if he made a deal to go to Ellendale Normal during the summer, he could write on a teacher's examination and get a temporary permit to teach for in the grades. So, well, Dad says he hasn't got any money. He can't go to. She says, and I don't know whether I could finance him to go to Ellendale Normal. And Johnson says, hell, we'll advance him the money, he says, to go to Ellendale Normal. So take it out of his salary a little each month. And so during that summer, I went along with two other guys from our local area in that Sargent County, and two women. We'd drive over on Monday morning and stay over the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night, and then come home on Friday evening. And we'd change off cars. There was two of them that owned pretty good cars, so we'd all ride in one car over there. And then at the end of that, I don't know, 8 weeks or 10 weeks, whatever it was, there were certain subjects we had to take, and then we wrote on teacher's examination, and then I taught school for 2 years during the 32, 33, and 33, 34. And that, of course, was the time when it really began to get dry in North Dakota, and the big dust storms were blowing over the country, and it was terrible, you know.
Yeah. Even though you had a good administration in Washington, you felt like it was very difficult on the farm. Really
bad, yeah.
Were they harvesting any crops then?
Nothing at all. They were burned out on Memorial Day in 1934. It became so dry and hot and terribly windy that we just suffocated with the Memorial Day program had to be held in the schoolhouse, and it became so thick with flying dust and so on, you could hardly see the people on the side, and it was just terrible. When I got home that night, I told my father, I said, I'm going to Fargo in the first part of June, and if I can get a place to work for some of my expenses, I'm going to go to Interstate Business College in Fargo. And so that's what happened. I drove up to Fargo in first part of June, and I guess I got there at a good time because the colleges, Concordia and North Dakota State Agricultural College and Morehead State College were graduating. Their students were moving away, and at Interstate Business College, I told them I needed to, I'd like to find some place to maybe earn some money to pay some of my expenses. And the president there said, why don't you go and see Mrs. Lee at the Bluebird Cafe? That was one of the really nice cafes in Fargo. They were in the Metropole Hotel, which is one of the big meeting places in Fargo. And I went there and asked for Mrs. Lee, and they sent me back in the kitchen. When I got back in the kitchen, I said, where's Mrs. Lee? And I want to talk to Mrs. Lee. She's sitting over there. She was sitting there drawing chickens. She had a great big tub of undrawn chickens she bought from a farmer. The farmer had dressed them out. And she was getting them ready for the evening meal. The evening meal was their big one. They served a light lunch, but not much for a noon lunch, but big evening meal. And so when I told her what I was interested, she says, well, you come at a good time. She says, I'm going to be losing some of my boys. She says, about 4 or 5 of my boys are, because school is out there graduating from college. She says, they've been with me a while, she says, but then she says, maybe you could learn to run the dishwashing machine, and if you can work from 6 to closing time, why, she said, I'll give you 2 meals a day. So she took me over to the machine and showed me what it looked like and so on. And then she says, okay, she says, you come on in Monday if you're going to enroll to school. And she says, you can start to work for me. So that's what I did. I worked for my 2 meals a day for the rest of that year at Interstate Business College. So I only went. I had taken by correspondence, I'd taken some business courses. So I already had some accounting and some legal business law and a few other things like that that I knew something about. So And then Interstate was pretty good too. Because I enrolled in the summertime, why then when the fall came along to September to people to begin, the president of the school there had me take his car and find rooms for the out-of-town kids to stay there. So that's the way I met one of my real good friends who was still living in California that way, farm boy from Pheasant. Was a real greenhorn. But and then by Christmas time, my money was gone, so then I had to stay on the farm again. And then in the summer of 1935, or spring of 1935, I worked for some farmers. I worked in the winter. I stayed home most of the time, but I do odd jobs for different ones. But the spring of the year, I worked for a farmer during the spring seeding season. And then a friend of mine had heard about that the stockyards were being built in West Fargo, and so they said, "Marv, let's go up there someday and see what it looks like up there." So that's what we did. We went up there, and we were both lucky to get work at building the stockyards.
This was somewhat after the period of time when livestock were selling so cheaply that people wouldn't get enough money to pay for the transportation.
And then, of course, in 36 it gets so darn dry and hot. The government was buying the cattle for $15, $20 a head, and those that couldn't walk, they were shooting them, and the rest of them they were bringing in. Most of them they were bringing into the West Fargo stockyards. And it was because of that drought and that program of the government buying the cattle that I got into the office. I worked on construction till in July, and the office was getting so darn busy figuring hay tickets and handling all the livestock in the stockyards. The construction foreman and the office manager were pretty good friends, and because in the construction I had been really doing a lot of not only labor work, but I had helped on the buy-in and on supplies and stuff like that, figuring out what was needed. So I had some lucky breaks with the construction people. And the construction foreman always kept telling the guy in the office, he says, "Why the hell don't you get Marv up here and help figure out some of this stuff you're hollering about? You're always behind." He said, "He can." So when all this hay was being bought and the cattle were coming in and he was way behind on his work in the office, he only had one girl and a secretary, and then a secretary to the president or to the manager, who was also handling the market reporting and so on. So he told Paulson, he told Akery to send me up one day at noon. So I went up there in my overalls, and Paulson says to me, "You know anything about a computer?" And I said, "Well, yeah." I said, "That little Monroe there looks like one I handled in school." And he says, "Well, gee, I got a lot of hay tickets here." He said, "And a big pile of them." He says, "And all of the haulers are begging for their money." He says, and our Herb that's the buyer is so darn fussy, he grades each load. He had 2 or 3 grades to every damn load of hay, and different prices, so you had to figure out the loads. So he says, "Sit down at that desk and take this. Here are the forms," he says, "and I want you to figure them out, so how much we owe this guy and how much we owe that guy and so on." So when I got done that evening and we got ready to go home, Paulson says to me, and Akery had told me, he says, "Paulson's kind of a gruffy guy." He says he'd lost his wife and he had a son about 13, 14 years old, and then his mother lived with him. He wasn't remarried, but he was and he says, "Paulson's kind of gruff." He says, "He'll bark at you." He says, "But don't pay any attention to him. He doesn't mean a damn thing by his biting." So when come evening to go home, Paulson says, "Well," he says, "you got quite a good bunch of them done, but," he says, "there's more of them to do." He says, "So come back," and he says, "We'll get you to finish these, and maybe there'll be some other things you can do." But he says, "God damn it," he said, "put on something different than those damn overalls," he said. So I got in the office, and as a result, I guess I hardly ever went back down to the yards except to do a little work here and there. And I was fortunate because it happened that I could fill in for different people when they went on vacation and so on. So I took the purchasing agent's place when he went on vacation. I took the livestock reporter, the guy that was doing that for QB. I'd take his place on the radio in the morning and evening when he'd go on vacation. And so I got onto the commission desk, which was largely what was my responsibility, was the association between the stockyards company that owned the facilities and provided the feed and watering and so on and the weighing with the commission firms. And there were 6 commission firms on the market there. So on. It was a good year. So
yeah. So what happens then?
Well, then I got married in 1938. We got married.
Your wife's name?
My wife's name was Donna Eriksson. She was a full-blooded Swede from Moorhead, Minnesota, that I met during the time I was going to Interstate Business College. And she became a telephone operator through a connection that she had with a friend of hers who was a long-distance operator there, too. And so we began courting, and in 1938 we were married, and right after we were married, we bought a lot out in West Fargo when there wasn't hardly any homes out there. And in 1939, we built a home in West Fargo. And in 1940, our first child was born in July. But anyway, in 1940, L.W. Cuby, who was traffic manager of the entire St. Paul Union Stockyards Company operation, and then also general manager at West Fargo, they decided to build a stockyards in Billings, Montana. And so, because I had had this various experience in the yard, Bill Cuby figured that Marv Evenson was the guy that ought to go to Montana as office manager and purchasing agent out there for a small yard. There was only four commissioning firms and a lot smaller operation. And but there were some people in St. Paul who thought that maybe it'd be better to have somebody from there, because the guy that was going to become yard superintendent was going to be from South St. Paul, and there was some of the office people down there that he had worked with that they thought should be it. But anyway, I got called into South St. Paul for an interview, and Cuby was along with me down there. So, but after talking to the president down at South St. Paul, Olson, I got the job of going to Billings, Montana. So in the fall of 1940, right, Labor Day, I flew to Billings, Montana, and helped get that yard ready for opening, and stayed there during the war years. Okay.
So how was it out there? Quite different than...
Yeah, it was somewhat different than West Fargo, because there were... the shipments of livestock were much larger, and it was largely a cattle market, and it was mostly beef cattle market out there. It was a enlarged consignment, so it was quite a lot different than West Fargo. But I got along real well there, and during the war years, I would have joined the Navy. My two brothers were already in the service, and I wanted to, if I was going to be called up, I wanted to join the Navy. But the Navy found out I was colorblind, so they wouldn't take me.
Okay.
And as a result, then the Stockyards Company wanted me deferred anyway, so I stayed on the job during the war years right there. And it was at the end of the war years, that I went to work for the Farmers Union and Livestock Association as their branch manager at Billings.
Oh, okay.
And the reason for that was because their branch manager at Billings during the time that he was out there, he came from West Fargo too, and he came from my hometown of Rutland. He was a good friend of mine and known all his life. He had married a girl who he knew they were fairly old when they got married, so they didn't have any kids. But she had been in the dry cleaning business most of her life with her brother in Breckenridge. That's where they started out with, and then her brother had owned some plants over in Wisconsin. And one of them came up for sale, and so she wanted to get back into that kind of business. So being the war was over with, Walt Strand decided to go with his wife's wishes, and so they went to Wisconsin and bought that dry cleaning plant. That left an opening there, and I had been pretty disgusted with the Stockyards Company anyway during the war years, and it seemed like Olson was always promising stuff he would never fulfill and so on. And the fact is, I had so much responsibility part of the time out there. It was terrible doing construction work and added work during the war years. You had to go through so much paperwork and so much. It was just heck. And I had told Olson that I said, I don't know whether I'm going to stay with the Stockyards Company after the war is over with. I says, because I said, I think you promise more than you can perform. And I said, I am really disgusted. I said, I knew that they had replaced the manager at West Fargo, and he had halfway promised me that I would get back there to be manager of the West Fargo yard. He told me when I interviewed him for going to Billings, he says, well, Marvin, go get things in order at Billings. And he says, an opening comes along in West Fargo. He says, we'll see if we can't move you back there. He said, where your family is really from and so on. And I told, so when this opening with Farmers Union came along, why I said kiss goodbye to the Stockyards Company, St. Paul Union Stockyards Company, and that's when I started working for Farmers Union.
Okay. And then what? You go to work for Farmers Union?
Well, there were many things happening at that time that some of which have been told, and some of which is known, and some of which isn't known. Mm-hmm. It's to the general public anyway. It was known to the directors. It was known to people around the stockyards industry. Farmers Union Livestock had gotten into a lot of trouble during the war years and before the war years. Charlie Egley was, I don't know if you ever knew him or met him or heard of him or not, but he was almost as far left as you could get without being a communist. And he had his hands into the farmer labor political machinery in Minnesota too.
Okay.
And one thing he was doing with the commission company was he was a great man to send out tracts with the proceeds of when you shipped livestock in there. You'd get a check from Farmers Union for your proceeds, but you'd also get a tract hyping the left-wing propaganda.
Okay.
And knocking the capitalistic system, sort of. Yeah. And as a result, he neglected also the operational end of the Stockyards Company. He didn't pay enough attention to what was happening among the salesmen and among the what was happening in some of their contracts, particularly in the sheep department and feeder lambs and so on. And the federal government had Lowry was a man by the name of Lowry, who was supervisor for the Bureau for the Stockyards, the Department of Agriculture, Packers and Stockyards Administration. He had an office in South St. Paul Exchange Building. And he supervised both West Fargo and Billings too, so I had gotten acquainted with him early in West Fargo because he had come up there a couple times a year, and sometimes more than that if there got to be some problems. There did get to be some problems, particularly in the horse market, because they were pretty hard to keep horse traders from violating things. But anyway, during and out at Billings, one of the members of the board of directors of Farmers Union Livestock had 9 members. 4 were from North Dakota, 2 from Montana, 2 from Minnesota, and 1 from Wisconsin. And Lowry had met with the board a few times in some years before that, maybe during the war years, and 44, 45, and he had warned the board about what was taking place, and the board had always promised him that they were going to do something about it. Well, anyway, I was aware of this situation because one of the board members was Jake Frank from Park City, Montana, and he was a good supporter of the Billings Yard and very active in politics in Montana and Farmers Union organization in Montana. And so Jake was, because of Jake, I knew what was taking place at South St. Paul. And I knew that Lowry had made these demands. And so in 1945, during 1945, well, I guess before that they started looking around, talking to different people about who would make a good manager. And Abner Larson was manager of the West River Co-op Finance Company, the credit deal at agricultural credit at Mandan. He was a pretty darn good operator. Abner was a real good man. He was, and so he was one of them under consideration. And of course, Jake Frank and the Montana people were promoting me. Jake thought I'd make a good man, so he wanted me to stop and see Glenn Talbot one time, which I did, and because he had to get the blessing of the organizational people, well, anyway, when in the summer, sometime in the summer of 45, the board met, and Lowry met with him and told him that he wanted to see some action now that the war was over with, or about ending, and had ended, and that they had to take some action. He said, we can't keep on what's going on. So they told him, they said, well, we've got it pretty well boiled down to 2 different guys now that we're considering for replacing Charlie Egley, and one of them is Abner Larson from Mandan, head of the production credit organization there in North Dakota. They got several branches, and pretty sharp guy financially, and so on. So the other one's Marvin Evenson, who's our branch manager at Billings. Lowry says to him, he says, well, Larson's probably a damn good man. He said, I don't doubt that, and I don't know what he knows about stockyards, but he says, I've known Marv Evenson since 1955, 56, or 40, 35, 36. And he says, I don't think there's anybody in the stockyards business that knows more about the Packers and Stockyards Act than Marv Evenson does. And he said, that's all I'm going to say. So he says, you make up your mind. But he says it's time for a change. So at the annual meeting in 1945, they made a change. They fired Charlie Egley and they hired me. Well, when I first went down there then early January, my family, I stayed at the Lowry Hotel. My family was still in Billings. I went down to that office and began looking into things. And I'd go down there in the evening because I was staying at the hotel. And boy, I'd call my wife and I'd say, I don't know why in the hell I took this job. I said, looks like a mess. After I'd been on the job about a week or 10 days, Lowry said, come on over to the office, Marvin. I'd like to talk to you. So I came over to his office, and he first of all, he said, congratulated me on the job and said, I'm glad to see that you're here, Marvin. He said, now he says, you've probably heard a lot of rumors and already know something about what's taking place over in your commission company. He said, and he pulled out a drawer. He had a big old wooden desk, and he pulled out a drawer, and he brought out a file about that goddamn thick. He says, Marvin, he says, in this file is enough material so I could have closed this doggone firm down a long time ago. But he says, I kept getting promises from the board that they were going to make changes. And he says, now that they've made it, he says, why, I think there'll be some changes happening, he says. And he says, I'm not going to touch this file again, he says, ever maybe, if I'll give you 60 days or so to begin. I think you'll soon learn what the hell's happening over there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, right away then, I began to find the violations that were rampant in there. And so first thing I did was fire the head of the sheep department, because he was operating his own daggone feedlot on selling to fictitious names and taking the goddamn sheep out there to his yard and feeding them and then bringing them back and making the money off of that and splitting it with the manager. And the cattle salesman, one of them, the head of the cattle department, he was planting odd and end cattle with dealers, and the dealers were softening his palm with cash, and the office girl and office manager and the office girl were in on that operation, and so it was just, so right after firing the sheep salesman, I made a deal with Central Co-op that they would handle the sales during the time that I was looking for a new sheep salesman. And soon things got around the yard and said, Jesus, that young Evenson is really batting away. And then on the cattle, we straightened that out after a while. And so we began to make progress. And from almost, they had fallen from way down, at one time they were among the top 5 firms. Mm-hmm. And then they had dropped to where they were down to about the 20th of, say, 26 firms in that yard, So it was disgusting to me when I first got down there. Farmers Union members would come to meetings in St. Paul for some of the other things. So they'd ship livestock, and they'd ship it to Weiler and Weiler, or they'd ship it to Midwest Farmers, or they'd ship it to Central. Mm-hmm. And then they'd come and visit with me about all the good things about Farmers Union, And I'd say, where the hell's your livestock? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So all you had to do was to begin getting the livestock back from the Farmers Union members.
Yeah.
So you had to get organized, for that. So that was, and so then we began to, make progress on that, and we developed a lot of different programs and so on to increase that, began to put a field staff together that would organize shipping associations better and do some of the things that Central was doing, to get things going and so on. So, And then in the fall of 46, or early 47, there came up the fact that we bought the first rendering plant in Wisconsin there, and so on, and then from there on, a year later, we acquired that 12 plants at Redwood Falls, and from that on, we really expanded and got into and took over operation of the Chicago operation of Farmers Union there because it was run by the Iowa Farmers Union, and they were having trouble, so we straightened that out.
Mm-hmm. At what point did South Dakota get in?
Pardon?
At what point did the South Dakota operations become? Was that along with Iowa then?
Yeah, the South Dakota was completely separate.
Mm-hmm.
It never did join the Farmers Union Livestock Association of South St. Paul. You know, it kept its own entity down here at the local yards. Yeah. Sioux Falls. Yeah, but it was the Farmers Union Livestock Commission Company.
Later on, of course, many years later, there were like 3 board members allotted to each state.
After they got into the rendering end of it, the byproducts, that got to be a much bigger operation than you see. And that's why in 1948, why I lost my position as general manager, and they thought, I guess it needed somebody smarter than I was to run the operation.
You want to talk about that a little bit? We talked about that before, how that came down.
Well, of course, in 1948, Harry Truman was going to lose the presidency. And I had gotten to work with Bill Thatcher and Emil Sifstad real well because we served on the Farmers Union Herald Board together, and we took part in many activities, educational activities together, and they seemed to insist that in particularly was well pleased, and I guess so was Thatcher with what I was doing anyway, and they saw that we were, making changes, and we were developing things that was moving in a forward way anyway. So we were beginning to make hay, in the industry, and particularly when we get in this byproduct thing. But anyway, in the fall of in the meeting of 1947, fall of 47, when they had the annual grain terminal meeting and annual livestock association meeting, why Senator Aiken from one of the eastern states, I forget which state it was now.
New Hampshire, Vermont.
Vermont, yeah, I think. He was going to be Secretary of Agriculture. Bill Thatcher was sure as hell that it was going to happen. And Bill was telling me, he said, that dumb goddamn Harry Truman, he says, he'll never win the election. He says, so they had Aiken out there for the main speaker at the goddamn 1947 annual meeting of the Grain Terminal Association. And because they wanted to curry up to him.
Yeah.
And then the guy that had helped Thatcher with his financing largely was Jim Wells. He was president of the Central Bank for Cooperatives in Washington, D.C. And Wells knew that he was going to be out of a job when Harry Truman was ousted. So he was looking for a place to land, and Bill Thatcher didn't want him to get outside. He wanted him where he could, get a hold of him for Farmers Union. And so Glenn Talbot met with Bill Thatcher, and I don't know who else met together, and Sifstad wasn't in on it. But they decided that they should make a place for Jim Wells. Well, where are they going to put him? In Thatcher's organization, he already had pretty high-powered guys, the two men that one is left, his financier man and his operational man. And so Thatcher says to Talbot, he says, well, goddamn, he says, the livestock house is doing pretty damn good now. He says, with this new byproduct thing, and it's going to take a hell of a lot of money to operate that and everything else. So keep it going. He said, geez, he says, we could hire Wells to be a part of that. Well, he said, hell, he won't take anything less than probably to be the big wheel. So, and then can we make him? What can we do? well, he says, Thatcher says, I think we can make a deal with Marv. We'll give Marv a raise in salary and we'll keep him on as assistant manager. Well, at the meeting in June and or July, I forget which it was, in 48, why, the entire board met and in St. Paul, and afterwards the executive committee met. The rest of the board went home, but they met with Talbot and Bill Thatcher. And they agreed with Bill Thatcher that they would offer Jim Wells my position. And they offered him a salary of $50,000 a year.
That's a lot of money in 1948.
At that time, it was a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the other directors, like Jake Frank at Billings, Montana, when they had the next meeting, he said, it's goddamn funny. He says, Marvin Evenson took the job for $550 a goddamn month when he come down here and straightened the son of a bitchin' thing out. And he says, now to replace him, we've got to hire a $50,000 a year man. Told the board. and then Bill Thatcher, so the executive got Walter Johnson. I don't know if you ever met him. He was from New York Mills. He was a guy from New York Mills, Minnesota. He was on the board. I think he was vice president. But anyway, the executive committee said, Walter, you stay over at the Lowry, and then you have a visit with Marv and tell him what has taken place. So the board had gone home the day before, and when Walt called me in the evening, a day or so after the board meeting, why, I said, geez, Walt, you're still in town? Yeah, he says, I'm still at the Lowry Hotel. I guess he had a daughter or two down there so that there was an excuse to for him to stay. And they would pay his expenses at the hotel. He says, Marvin, come on down to the hotel. He says, I need to talk to you. So I went down to the Lowry and went up to his room, and he was snookered. He was just drunk as a lord. And he said, Marvin, he says, we had an executive board meeting. He said, after the regular meeting, and met with Thatcher and Talbot. And he said, it looks like, he says, we're making a deal with Jim Wells to take your place as general manager. He didn't tell me anything about salary. Oh, I says, Jesus. I says, is that right? And he started to cry, and he said, yeah. He says, and Marvin, you've got to stay with us, though. He says, you can be the assistant general manager. And he says, Thatcher and Glenn have agreed that you're entitled to a little increase in salary and so on. And I said, well, Walter, I said, I don't know. I said, was the full board in on it? No, he said, it was just the executive committee. So I go home and I talked a little bit to my wife about it and so on. And, of course, she didn't know, and she didn't make much difference what I decided to do. She said it was up to me. So the next morning after I did this visit with Thatcher, after Walter Johnson, I called Thatcher in the morning. And I told Thatcher, I said, listen, I said, Bill and Walter Johnson met with him in the hotel, Lowry. And I said, he had a kind of a sad story to tell me. And he said, I think you know quite a bit about what took place. And he said, yeah, he says, Marvin, he said, why don't you come on over to the office and we'll have a little talk. So I beat it over to Thatcher's office, and so after he gave me the story about how Wells was going to lose, Truman was going to lose, and Wells was going to lose, and how they had to take care of Wells and all that kind of stuff, he gave me the whole story on it. And then he said, the byproducts with this and the livestock house now are doing pretty damn well, he says, and so he says, Wells can take over because he can handle the financing. Really, it's more of a name than anything else. And he says, you stay on as assistant manager. He says, you handle particularly the marketing end of it. He says, you've done damn good at that, and the financing. And I said, well, Bill, I said, did this appear before the full board? And he said, no, just the executive committee. He says, they've got the power to do that. He says, they got the power to hire and fire some management. I said, yeah, I said, I realize that, but I said, you know, Bill, he says, oh yeah, he says to me, and he says, my job is to talk you in to stay on as assistant manager. And I said to him, Bill, I said, you know, I said, if this had been done with the full board appearing, brought up before the full board, so it had been actioned by the full board, and I'd have been called in, who had a chance to, had my input into it. I says, I might have stayed on as assistant general manager, but I said, I don't like the way the thing has been handled. And I said, I don't think this is a job. You've done just about everything you wanted to do, but I said, I think this job of making me stay as assistant manager isn't going to work out for you, because I said, I got to live with myself, and I said, I don't like what the hell you've done. And so I said, I'm going to write to the board my resignation. So I went back to the office and I wrote a letter of resignation to the board, and when the rest of the board, some of the rest of the board got my letter of resignation, they threw up their arms. Fred Griffith over at Ortonville, he was so damn mad, he just thought that the executive board, he was way out of bounds. Jake Frank from Montana was just irate about it. Lloyd Lassie from North Dakota, out in the western part of the state, he didn't like it. And it was just one of those things that that some of the board was pretty upset about. And particularly, during the time of the acquirement of the rendering plants, I had worked with two men from the Department of Agriculture, a fellow by the name of Gibbs and a fellow by the name of Ray Fox. And they were really surprised about it. They wrote me letters, and they offered to help me get jobs with other commission companies, cooperative association places, and so on. And I got correspondence and stuff on all of that stuff right in here. So, and it was just one of those things that it was. But I decided that I didn't want to. I knew that the political end of it, unless you satisfied two men, Glenn Talbot and Bill Thatcher, your place in the Farmers Union wasn't going to last too damn long, because that just wasn't going to happen. So I went up and worked with my brother for a while, and then after the Second World War, you know, you could sell. I got involved with a man in Fergus Falls who was a distributor of heating equipment, and it happened that just at the time when and my brother was in that kind of work, and my dad was down in my hometown of Rutland. My brother was in Fargo, and so this man at Fergus Falls wanted me to go to work as a salesman for him, and he had a pretty good product, and so the Farmers Union Central Exchange was just going into the LP business at that time, putting in these LP plants, and they were looking for loads on their LP plants. And so, of course, heating was a big thing, you know, LP heating for farm homes.
Tanks out on the farms.
Yeah. So when Jacobson and I came up, and he wanted me to go out to look up dealers in different parts of North Dakota. So right after I agreed that maybe I'd try to work with him on a commission basis, you know. So we started out one day in Moorhead. That's where I had moved back to, and we went out to Castleton. They were building a plant out there. They were building an LP plant out there, and I knew the guys that were involved, and I knew the manager of the oil company there pretty well. So we walked in, and Bill Martin was on the board of the Central Exchange at the time, and he was had a pretty nice farmhouse out there. And we got talking with the manager, and I was telling what, when they knew me, the guys there, and I was telling the manager what I was doing here with the, and being there with LP gas, and I said, you could set up a heating department here, and Martin says, by God, yes. He says, I'll buy one of the goddamn furnaces. He says, right away. He figured out for me. He says, come on out to my place and do it. And I said, Jacobson and I, we can do some engineering for you, and we can get installation crews, and you can get some. So we started down the road and to Valley City, and Jacobson says, where the hell is the next place? Well, I says, Valley City is really the next good stop for a Farmers Union Oil Company. And so I said, if we want to really get into it, I said, we maybe should work with the exchange people. So, where the hell, how would we do that? I said, we'd have to go to South St. Paul and talk to Murray down there. So he's the guy that's in charge of the LP operation. So he turned around right square, and then I says to him, well, there's a man in Moorhead that's a good friend of mine, Sandy, he's a field man for the exchange, and I said, Hans would know how the hell best to handle it. So I says, we have to talk to Hans first. So he says, and I said, I think Hans is home, because I said it was early in the week. And I said, he probably hasn't gone out yet to make his rounds, but I said, he's right there. And I said, I see him a lot because we play cards together and so on. So I said, we're good friends. So we turn around and go back to my place, and I call Hans Sandy up, and he happened to be home. And so he says, come on over. He says, so after we talking to Hans that night, he says, well, come on over tomorrow morning, he says, and I'll get a hold of Murray down at the exchange and see what can be done, see what he thinks about the idea. So Hans calls him up in the morning and talks to Murray, puts Murray on the phone with me, and it's, well, goddamn, Murray says, come on down, talk to us. So Jacobson and I went to the exchange and we signed an agreement to provide him with the equipment, and then we would provide him with installation and engineering service to get him started on the development of their LP heating deal.
Okay.
Yeah, and I worked with Jacobson for about a year and a half or so. Well, maybe not quite a year and a half, about that. I guess it was a year and a half, maybe a little longer. But he was one of these guys that he would begin substituting if he didn't have in stock a certain furnace of a certain type, then he'd start substituting, and I didn't like that because the dealers didn't like it, and oftentimes why I just tell them don't accept it, but make him pay for the return of it. And I said, and we got the Camp brothers, and my brother did installation work for him. We had another guy in Moorhead that had a portable outfit that would do installation work, and then the Camp boys from Wilmer came up to North Dakota, and we're still in the business out there in North Dakota. We got them to be. So that was the next evolvement into our connection with my connection with Farmers Union. But then after a while, I quit Jacobson too, and went to work for the Fargo Foundry as a commission salesman for them.
Okay. How long did you do that then?
Well, I stayed in that with the Foundry for quite a few years, and then when they had 20 men on the road after the Second World War, all on a commission basis.
Yeah.
And I got familiar with everything that they sold practically, mostly oil equipment, tanks and pumps and so on. And then when they dropped, structural steel began to take over, and then they cut back their commission salesmen to about a dozen. And so I went to work with Northwest Oil Equipment in Moorhead, and I was intending on staying with them. They always promised me I was going to buy and get a chance to buy in with them, and as a result, 7 years went by. I doubled their volume of business and didn't get a chance to be a part of their company. And in '68, I got a chance to buy in with a firm in Mandan, Midwest Truck and Oil Equipment, and I went out there and became part of that. And I ended up being the sole owner of the property. And there was three of us in it to start with, and then the one man sold out to the shop foreman and I operated that until in the late '80s as an operating company, and then we owned the property and leased out to Hobbs out of Grand Forks and so on. So, and then in 2003, when my contract for deed was up, or contract for deed on the property, the Krenelkas had paid it down to where they felt they could go to the bank and save themselves some interest. So that's why I came here to Sioux Falls.
Oh, okay.
So that's pretty much my life story. So.
All right. You mentioned earlier when we didn't have the recorder on about some relationship with the Minnesota Farmers Union. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, yes.
Was that at the time you were at the commission firm?
Yeah, right after when I was out, after I had left the commission firm, why several of the field men and the, I don't know whether I mentioned that Einar Quivinen was president of the Minnesota Farmers Union.
I think you did before,
yeah.
We didn't have the recorder on.
And he because of a couple of women in the educational department, he wasn't able to make progress like he wanted to and so on. And there were others that felt that there ought to be some new leadership in the Farmers Union, so of the Educational Association.
Mm-hmm.
So they came to me and wanted to know if I wouldn't run for presidency of the Farmers Union. The Farmers Union oil company managers, there was 3 or 4 of them that were real hepped on me being state, because they were good dynamiters in the organization too, and they wanted me to, fellow at Benson, fellow at Wilmer, and a fellow at Moorhead, and one guy at Thief River Falls. Several of them, they just felt that I should become president of the educational organization. Mm-hmm. And some of the farmers, Ed Wiesett and Art Jorvey and Kenny Jones and several others, they met with me a couple different times. Mm-hmm. But I decided that unless you satisfied Bill Thatcher, why, you weren't going to last long in the educational organization either. So.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your wife. You had kids.
Well, I had 4, 1 boy and 3 girls, and
mm-hmm.
and they all went to high school, finished high school in Moorhead, except for my youngest one, finished at Bismarck, North Dakota, for her high school. Mm-hmm. And my son was the oldest, and then 3 girls.
Okay, where are they at now?
Well, my oldest daughter is still in Bismarck. She's married to a man that was with International Harvester for many, many years, and mm-hmm. she worked for the organization that developed from Lutheran Homes and Hospital as an addiction counselor, as a family, she's a family counselor.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But she's having a bout with cancer now, and she's able to go on early retirement, I think, now this year. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then my middle daughter was a teacher in Sheridan, Wyoming for many years, and she died of cancer in 2002. She was a speech and drama teacher. She put on 22 musicals during the time she was there. And when she died, after she died, they dedicated the auditorium in the school, the Sue Henry Theater for Performing Arts, and put a big plaque on the wall. And then my youngest daughter here works for the State Health Department as a licensed nutritionist.
Okay.
She's a surveyor of nursing homes and mm-hmm. hospitals.
All right.
And so she's gone a lot of the week. She'll be home this evening because she teaches a class of nutrition to nurses here in town on Thursday nights. But she usually gets done on Thursdays with her field work and is back in town on Thursday afternoons. And my son has been one of Ma Bell's boys for all his career life, except that after he retired from Ma Bell, he was with Lucent for a while. And
that's their laboratories, wasn't it?
Yeah, Bell Labs in Whippany, New Jersey. He was in there. So, yeah, he has been a very fortunate guy. He is able to retire. But he wants to teach yet a couple more years. He teaches computer languages at Central Florida University in Orlando. So they asked him to come on out there and write his own ticket. So he's got a soft job. He's for a few more years anyway.
Yeah. Do you feel like you've retired finally? It sounds like it took you a long time to decide to.
Well, I don't. I've had a very interesting life, of course, and I've been very fortunate. I've never had any serious illness or anything, and so I really have been fortunate. I have been whatever I did, I always wanted to be active in things. And I have been active in the educational field, and I served on the school board in Moorhead, Minnesota, and I've been very active in political arena since the days of FDR. As a young Democrat when I was teaching school, we had a pretty good young Democrat club in our county, and I was active in that. And in Minnesota, I got to know, of course, Humphrey in 1946 when I was with the Farmers Union. He was mayor of Minneapolis, and I became part of the early people that worked to build the DFL party, and I actually brought Bob Berglund into politics, and so. So I brought him into elective politics. He would have been in it anyway. And his father and mother were good Democrats in Roseau County, and I didn't. I went to caucuses in 1946 and 48 in South St. Paul. And then in 52 became active up in what was the old 9th District in Minnesota politics. And
was that at the time when Koya Knutson was a congresswoman from up there? Yeah. And it was just across the Red River from where I grew up.
Close.
We heard a lot of news from over there.
There's a whole story on Minnesota politics that I could tell you too. That's I've seen it from the inside and out, all kinds of ways. We've had some. I was a delegate to 2 international Democratic conventions, national conventions. The one in '60, which Bobby Kennedy run with a tight fist, and then the rambunctious one in '68 in Chicago. That was tough to control by anybody. That was a wild deal.
Yeah, I think a lot of people out here early on were Humphrey supporters in 1960. I remember listening to the Wisconsin primary results on the radio and being disappointed.
Yeah, big disappointment, Yeah, I've got the Life magazine. I just sorting through some of my... I'm going to turn over all my... I've got files full of political stuff, and I've got 2 big cases full of both the literature, both items from the 60 and the 68 conventions. I'm going to put them in the archives at the Moorhead State college at Moorhead, because I think that they've got a good place to keep that stuff and so on. Yeah. I'm just in the process of beginning to sort through the stuff personal stuff that I want to make copies of for my kids to see, and then the rest of it will go to Moorhead, and I'm going to try to get it there before the school starts this fall. I've already made, on May 1st or March 31st, I was at Moorhead State, and I met with the ex-president and with some of the archival people there, so they know that I've got this stuff coming, and that they'll be glad to get it. So,
when you, my usual concluding question is: are you a pessimist or an optimist?
I'm very much an optimist.
I don't think anybody could ever do anything in their life if they were a pessimist.
No, that's right. I have always been very optimistic about things. Sometimes I'm a little discouraged at how things are going, but I realize there is swings of up and down and so on, and I've been fortunate in that I've known an awful lot of political figures. Humphrey, I never had a college education, otherwise I probably could have had a pretty good appointment during the Johnson administration when Humphrey was vice president. There was one job when I was with Northwest Oil Equipment that I did attempt to make a stab at getting, and that was being head of the Small Business Administration in North Dakota. But we were living in Moorhead, and Senator Burdick got to be, it was really his call. A man from Hastings, Minnesota, was regional head of Small Business Administration, and a good friend of mine. And Burdick's had a banker in Minot that he wanted appointed to the job, and so they had a swearing-in ceremony at the federal building in Fargo when he took over, and I was left out. But the regional man, when he was sitting at the airport, had a little time after the swearing in. He called me up in Moorhead. I happened to be home. He says, "Come on over and have coffee with me." And he says to me, "Goddamn, Marvin," he says, "I wish I was swearing you in today instead of the man that I swore in." And I said, well, I said, I realized that I said, this is it was Burdick's call, and I live in Minnesota, so Humphrey didn't have as much influence on it as probably he could have had if he'd have wanted to. But I said, I know Burdick real well. They're close friends of us. So I said, Burdick had been our attorney in the Farmers Union, too.
Yes.
Farmers Union lifetime. And so I said, but a few years later, the banker from Minot went bad, and he got really in trouble with the law and everything else. He got booted out. And then, of course, when it got to be in a Republican administration, why, Mark Andrews got the big job. Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
So I've got a file on that, too.
I bet you got files on everything here. It looks like it.
So, yeah, it was one of those things that would have been interesting to have done, but I'm glad I never really, I could have been postmaster of Moorhead too, but I was never a great man to believe in bureaucracy, because I always felt that from what I had seen of the stockyards and administration, the Packers and Stockyards administration, and other government entities, there was always a lot of paperwork and a lot of red tape. I did work for the federal government in 1935 by taking farm census for a couple of townships in Sargent County during the winter of 1935 before I went back to the stockyards. So. Yeah. Up there to work. Yeah. So So I never was real, unless I could have been, you know, at an administrative position, someplace where the red tape and the government regulations never did appeal to me.
Yeah.
And I liked the challenge of of production. Yeah. I liked the idea of a commissioned salesman, because one time at the Fargo Foundry, we were handling a product that we couldn't compete with Minneapolis firms and certain kind of tanks, and I had lost a couple of few sales that had meant quite a bit of commission to me. That one week I was out, and I called my boss on Friday afternoon and told him, I says, wait in the office, I want to go over a couple of things with you on this doggone catalog of ours, and that I'm pretty disgusted with. So he waited for me, and then when I got there, I said, we ought to tear these sheets out of the catalog and forget about trying to sell them. I says, we can't compete with these Minneapolis outfits on this. So I says, God, I said, I lost about a couple $100 worth of commissions this week just because of what the hell they're bringing them in by the truckload lots to guys in the southern part of the state, and I can't compete with them. So, but anyway, Carl Akron, who was vice president and head of the steel department, I didn't know that he was still around there. He stood in the doorway and came over to me, and he tapped me on the shoulder, and he says, Evenson, he says, who the hell do you think writes your check for you? And I looked at him real hard, and I said, who writes my check, Akron? I said, God damn it, I don't want to ever believe that the Fargo Foundry is the one that writes my checks for me. I said, I work on a commission basis, and it's the guy that signs my goddamn orders that's writing the checks for me. And I says, anytime I forget that, I ought to go over here on the Red River Bridge and jump off. So he turned around and he went back to his office, and my boss says to me, goddamn, Marvin, I don't know whether you're going to have a job Monday morning or not. So I come in Monday morning, and Roy says to me, he says, Marvin, he says, Akron wants to see you up in the office. I goes up in the office, and Akron says, Evenson, he said, I guess we had a few hard words, he says, Friday afternoon. Yeah, I said, I think that's probably right, but I said, I haven't changed my mind one damn bit. And then he laughed, and he said, you know, he says, after I got home, he says, Friday evening, I began thinking about that. He says, God damn, he says, you're right. He says, we got to do something about this goddamn thing. He says, I'll get together with the production department and see if we can't be competitive with those damn Minneapolis outfits. He says. So, and yeah, we were good friends all the time after that, you know. So. But that's the way I felt about things, you know. And it was good relations, you know. After I moved out to Manda, North Dakota, I had people from the eastern part of the state that had been my customers call me and say, Marvin, we're Kindred Co-op Oil called. Marvin, we're going to change around our bulk plant a little bit. He says, you did such a goddamn good job a few years ago. Come on over and give us an estimate. And I said, holy Christ, I says, I can't do that. I said, if I cover my expenses and all that, he says, I can't compete with O'Day and the rest of the boys that are in the business. R&R had started up by that time, and I said, I'd like to, and I appreciate the call. Standard Oil men would come to the Minot refinery when Amoco was running it from that Grafton and Grand Forks up Bayview and up in there. Come out to my office in Manda and said, Marvin, why the hell don't you make some trips up in our country once in a while? I said, we got some jobs we'd like to have you bid on. So on, you know. And I said, Jesus, I said, you're too far away. I said, you got good guys up there that can do you good. I said, so I said, I'll stick to our western part of the state here, part of South Dakota, some of Montana. Okay. That's what I did. So. All right. But that was pretty nice to be able to do that, and there wasn't a damn place that I couldn't always go back to, you know, and so on. So, and that was the way it was in the stockyards game too, you know. Olson, when I left the Farmers Union and got out of the livestock game, Tony Olson had been manager of them. We'd had differences, you know. After I got to South St. Paul and wasn't working for the Stockyards Company anymore, we had differences on different kind of things, and many times. But when I left the livestock house and went selling, why, Olson let word be known. He says, Marvin, anytime you want to come back to work for us, he says, we'll find a spot for you. So that was pretty nice to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else that you'd
Well,
like to add?
maybe you want to see some pictures.
Yeah, let me just sign off on this. We've been visiting with Marvin Evenson. Thank you for participating in the Cooperative Legacy Project. See project. See project. See project. See project.